In 2006, a survey of professional economists found that only 2% predicted a recession would occur within the next 2 years. By 2010, when researchers asked those same economists if they had seen the 2008 financial crisis coming, over 40% claimed they had. The math doesn't add up. But their brains had already rewritten history. This isn't about lying. It's about something far more dangerous to your wealth. Hindsight bias is your brain's tendency to look at an outcome and convince itself that this outcome was predictable all along. Once you know what happened, it becomes almost impossible to remember what you actually thought would happen before it occurred. Picture this scenario. You're watching a football match, and your team is losing at halftime. Your friend says they might mount a comeback. You think it's unlikely, but say nothing. 2 hours later, your team wins in the final minute. Now, try to remember exactly how unlikely that comeback felt at halftime. Your brain will tell you that you kinda saw it coming, that the momentum was shifting, that their striker looked dangerous. But that's not what you actually thought. Your brain has seamlessly integrated the outcome into your memory of the prediction process. Psychologists Baruch Fishoff and Ruth Bath first documented this phenomenon in the 1970s. They asked people to predict the outcomes of Nixon's diplomatic visits to China and Russia. After the trips concluded, they asked those same people to recall what they had predicted. People consistently remembered their predictions as being closer to what actually happened than they really were. Fishoff called this the knew-it-all-along effect. And here's what makes it so insidious. The subjects weren't lying. They genuinely believed they had predicted the outcomes accurately. Their brains had rewritten the memory itself. This happens because your brain is not a video recorder. It's more like a Wikipedia page that anyone with access can edit. And the editor is your present self with full knowledge of what happened. Every time you recall a memory, you slightly reconstruct it based on what you know now. Daniel Kahneman addresses this in Thinking Fast and Slow, explaining how our remembering self often distorts what our experiencing self actually felt. In everyday life, this bias is mostly harmless. It makes us feel smarter at pub quizzes and more insightful during film plot twists. But when it comes to money, hindsight bias doesn't just bruise your ego. It destroys your wealth. Let's travel back to September 2008. Lehman Brothers, the fourth largest investment bank in America, is collapsing. It's been in business for 158 years, survived the Great Depression, and employs over 25,000 people. Within 24 hours of filing for bankruptcy on September 15th, it will trigger the worst financial crisis since 1929. Here's what almost nobody tells you. Virtually no one saw it coming. Not the experts. Not the regulators. Not even the short sellers who later claimed they predicted everything. In August 2008, just 1 month before Lehman collapsed, the bank's stock was trading at $14 per share. Analysts at major firms were still rating it as a buy or hold. The Federal Reserve had examined Lehman's books multiple times that summer. On September 10th, 5 days before bankruptcy, Lehman's CFO told investors the firm had adequate capital and liquidity. Were they lying? Some were certainly downplaying problems. But most genuinely believed the bank would survive, because the alternative was unthinkable. Banks of this size didn't just disappear. When Lehman filed for bankruptcy, it listed $639 billion in assets and $619 billion in debts. The bankruptcy filing itself was 700 pages long. The ripple effects were immediate. The Dow Jones dropped 504 points in a single day. Credit markets froze globally. Within weeks, Washington Mutual collapsed, making it the largest bank failure in U.S. history. Iceland's entire banking system imploded. But here's where hindsight bias becomes truly dangerous. By 2009, everyone had a theory about why the crisis was inevitable. Subprime mortgages were obviously a disaster waiting to happen. The housing bubble was clearly unsustainable. Lehman's leverage ratios were transparently reckless. Credit default swaps were obviously too complex. The signs were everywhere, people said. How could anyone have missed them? Except they did miss them. Nearly everyone did. A study published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 2009 analyzed predictions from professional forecasters between 2000 and 2008. Of the 77 countries that experienced recessions in 2008 and 2009, only 2 had recessions predicted by the consensus forecast a year in advance. 2 out of 77. The International Monetary Fund, with all its resources and expertise, failed to predict a single recession in any major economy in 2008. But by 2010, financial commentators were writing articles about how the crisis was predictable if you'd just been paying attention. Your brain performs the same trick after every market crash. Researchers have spent decades studying why hindsight bias is so persistent and so dangerous. In one landmark study, psychologist Hal Arkis asked medical students to read case histories of actual patients and diagnose what had killed them. But there was a twist. Some students were told the actual cause of death before making their diagnosis. Others weren't. The students who knew the outcome were significantly more confident that the cause of death was obvious from the case history. But here's the critical part. When researchers asked them to estimate how obvious it would have been without knowing the answer, they dramatically underestimated the difficulty. They couldn't mentally travel back to their state of ignorance. Neuroscientist Henning Plessner has used brain imaging to understand why. When you learn an outcome, your brain immediately creates neural pathways connecting the outcome to prior information. These pathways strengthen the perceived connection between cause and effect. When you try to remember what you thought before, your brain uses these new pathways. You literally cannot access your original thought process anymore. This has profound implications for investors. Think about every time you review your portfolio after a market movement. Your brain is not objectively analyzing what happened. It's retrofitting a narrative that makes the outcome seem predictable. Morgan Housel explores this brilliantly in The Psychology of Money. He writes about how financial history is taught as if the outcomes were inevitable, when the people living through those moments had no idea what would happen next. The Great Depression, the dot-com bubble, the 2008 crisis. All of them feel obvious in retrospect. None of them felt obvious at the time. Researchers have found that hindsight bias is particularly strong in three situations. First, when outcomes align with your pre-existing beliefs. If you generally thought the housing market was overvalued, you'll remember being more certain about the crash than you actually were. Second, when outcomes are extreme, a 50% market crash feels more predictable, in hindsight, than a 5% correction. And third, when you have a financial stake in claiming you predicted it. This last point is crucial. Studies show that financial professionals exhibit stronger hindsight bias than ordinary people. Why? Because their credibility depends on appearing to have insight that others lack. A fund manager who admits they were completely blindsided by a crash loses clients. A fund manager who claims they saw warning signs and positioned accordingly keeps their job. The result is an entire industry built on reconstructed memories, where everyone claims prescience, and nobody admits to being genuinely surprised. Now, some people genuinely did predict the 2008 crisis, and studying them reveals something fascinating about the difference between real foresight and hindsight bias. Take Michael Burry, the hedge fund manager portrayed in The Big Short. Burry began analyzing subprime mortgage bonds in 2005. He discovered that many were filled with loans to borrowers who couldn't possibly repay them. He spent months convincing banks to create credit default swaps that would pay out when these bonds failed. By early 2006, he had positioned his fund to profit from a housing collapse. But here's what makes his story different from hindsight bias. He paid an enormous price for being right too early. Throughout 2006 and most of 2007, while the housing market kept rising, Burry's investors revolted. They demanded their money back. They threatened lawsuits. Some called him incompetent. The psychological toll was immense. Burry later wrote that those years were the most difficult of his professional life. He wasn't confident and vindicated. He was isolated and uncertain, watching his thesis bleed money month after month. That's what real prediction looks like. It's uncomfortable, lonely, and expensive. Compare that to the hundreds of analysts who now claim they predicted the crisis. They don't mention the years of pain. They don't acknowledge the social cost of being a contrarian. They simply present their prediction as obvious wisdom that anyone could have seen. Morgan Stanley's chief economist, Stephen Roach, provides another case study. He spent years warning about unsustainable debt levels and housing prices. But when the crisis finally hit, he didn't celebrate. In interviews, he acknowledged that he'd been warning about similar problems for so long that even he had started to doubt his analysis. The timing was far less certain than hindsight makes it appear. This reveals a crucial truth. Genuine predictions come with a massive burden of doubt. Hindsight bias erases that doubt entirely. It gives you the illusion that you could have predicted the outcome, without the pain, the uncertainty, or the cost of actually doing so. The danger compounds when investors use this false confidence to predict the next crisis. Studies have found that people who believe they predicted the 2008 crash, whether they actually did or not, are more likely to make extreme predictions about future market movements. They've convinced themselves they have superior insight. In reality, they've just convinced themselves they had superior insight in the past. This creates what researchers call the illusion of explanatory depth. You believe you understand complex systems like financial markets better than you actually do, and that illusion leads directly to your next financial mistake. So how do you protect yourself from a bias that literally rewrites your memories? The answer isn't about having a better memory. It's about creating systems that preserve your actual predictions before outcomes occur. First, write down your investment theses before you make decisions. Not vague feelings, but specific predictions with reasoning. I'm buying this stock because I expect revenue growth of 15% over the next 2 years, driven by expansion into Asian markets. Be detailed. Be specific. Date the entry. 6 months later, when you review that investment, you'll have evidence of what you actually thought, not what your brain wants to remember thinking. Professional investors call this keeping an investment journal. It's one of the most powerful tools against hindsight bias, and almost nobody does it because it's uncomfortable. Second, study your failures without reconstructing them. When an investment goes wrong, resist the urge to explain why it was, obviously, doomed. Instead, ask what information you had at the time, and whether your decision-making process was sound given that information. A good process can lead to bad outcomes. That's not a failure, that's probability. Third, be deeply skeptical of anyone who claims they predicted major market movements, not because they're necessarily lying, but because their brain has likely rewritten their memories. If someone tells you they saw 2008 coming, ask them to show you dated evidence, articles they published, trades they made, specific warnings they issued. Most won't have it. Philip Tetlock, who runs the Good Judgment Project studying forecasting accuracy, has found that the best predictors share a crucial trait. They constantly update their beliefs with new information and admit uncertainty. The worst predictors make bold claims, ignore contradicting evidence, and insist their past predictions were accurate even when records prove otherwise. Fourth, remember that uncertainty is not a weakness. It's reality. Financial markets are complex adaptive systems influenced by millions of variables. Anyone who claims they can consistently predict major movements is either delusional or selling something. Usually both. Let's return to where we started. Those economists who claimed in 2010 that they'd predicted the 2008 crisis? Their reconstructed memories weren't just false, they were dangerous. Because they used that false confidence to make bold predictions about future crises that were equally wrong. The real lesson of Lehman Brothers isn't that the crisis was unpredictable. It's that your brain will convince you afterward that it was predictable. And that conviction will make you overconfident about the next crisis, the next market crash, the next black swan event that nobody actually sees coming. The best investors aren't the ones who claim they predicted every disaster. They're the ones who build portfolios resilient enough to survive disasters they know they cannot predict. They accept uncertainty. They prepare for multiple outcomes, and they keep detailed records that prevent their memories from becoming fiction. Your brain is going to rewrite history. That's not a bug. It's a fundamental feature of human cognition. But your wealth depends on recognizing when it's happening and building systems to counteract it. Because the most expensive mistake isn't failing to predict the next crash. It's believing you'll see it coming when you won't. If this video changed how you think about market predictions, you'll want to watch our breakdown of recency bias and why investors keep buying at market peaks. The pattern is almost mathematical, and it explains why timing the market is fundamentally broken.